In today's video, we're going to talk about Khrushchev and a period of the Cold War which is known as the Thaw. There are 4 essential questions that you're going to need to be able to answer at the end of this video. The first, who was Nikita Khrushchev? The second, why were Eastern European and Western leaders hopeful when Khrushchev took control of the USSR in 1953? The third, what were de-Stalinisation, the Warsaw Pact, and peaceful coexistence? And finally, the fourth, why was this period of the Cold War one of the most tense? The key point of today's video is that although it might seem on the surface like this period was one of decreasing tension, in fact, it's one of the most dangerous periods of the war. So let's start with 1953 and the death of Stalin. Stalin's real name is something I don't even want to try to pronounce for fear of mangling it quite badly, but I've written it on the screen for you. Stalin ruled Russia from 1924 to 1953 as an authoritarian dictator. And, generally speaking, he did some good things for the country, but there were a lot of problems with his rule. First, he collectivized agriculture. Previous to this, farms were small and family-run. The problem with this was that it wasn't producing enough to expand industry or export overseas, and individual farmers couldn't afford to modernize their farms by themselves. So, in 1927, Stalin asked people to voluntarily unite their farms together. This didn't go over very well, and so, in 1930, Stalin made it compulsory. This met with a lot of resistance. Peasants didn't want to hand over their land to the government, and there were famines as a result. But by 1939, 99% of the land had been collectivized. The government took about 90% of the crops to be redistributed to the cities and exported, and left the farmers with 10% to live on. The second thing Stalin did was he industrialized Russia. Stalin wanted to do this because it would help the USSR gain global importance. He was able to achieve his goals, but again there were some hiccups and problems. For example, wages were low, strikers and lazy workers could be executed, and many workers died from accident, starvation, as well as the cold. Furthermore, throughout the 1930s there was a period known as the Great Terror, which was when Stalin purged the population by killing people or putting them into forced labor camps called gulags. In fact, overall he sent about 20 million ordinary Russians to gulags, in which approximately half died. Overall, Stalin did a few good things for Russia. However, millions of people died or were put into prison because of him. In 1953 he died, and he was such a legend, the people loved him. Or maybe it was because if you didn't love and praise him, you would be shot. That the big question was, who could fill his shoes? Who would replace him? And out of everybody, Nikita Khrushchev came to the top. He was born in a town called Kalinovka, which is near the Ukraine, in 1894, and he died in 1971. 6 months after Stalin died, Khrushchev was elected premier, and he ruled until 1964. He had a reputation for efficiency, and he had actually helped build the Moscow Underground as the sort of overseer or project manager. Also, he spoke to people, which was something that Stalin had never done. So people were quite optimistic about his election. On the other hand, he was very hard to predict. However, in today's video, we're going to be looking at the things that demonstrate that in the beginning of his reign, he seemed to want peace. Then, in our next video, we will look at how he was actually very brutal in certain circumstances. So one of the first things that Khrushchev did when he got into power was give a speech at the meeting of the whole entire Communist Party on February 25, 1956. This speech is known as the secret speech, and it was quite an important development. This speech was 4 hours long, and it attacked Stalin and introduced the idea of the cult of personality. He basically said that everyone was bigging up Stalin so that Stalin had become like an idol to a cult. People worshipped him, kind of like a legend or a myth. And Khrushchev said that Stalin thought that Stalin himself was above the party. Furthermore, Khrushchev voiced what everyone was kind of thinking, that Stalin was brutal. To prove this point, Khrushchev dug up a whole bunch of examples about how Stalin had murdered people. In addition to his major rant about Stalin, Khrushchev also goes on to state that all of the historical victories of the party were a result not of Stalin, but of the Soviet people working together as a team. He ended his speech by saying that the USSR had to abolish the cult of personality, this idea that Stalin was a legend and a myth, and restore correct communism and go back to the ideas that Lenin proposed. Why did Khrushchev give this speech? Khrushchev was a member of Stalin's cabinet, and basically he knew that sooner or later the truth was going to come out about the purges and the gulags, the forced labor camps. And so he's preemptively letting it out of the bag. He also wanted to shift blame for purges onto his rivals. So even though Khrushchev was responsible for killing people, he wanted it to seem as if his rivals were the ones who did it. And third, he believed that Stalin's system had held up progress, because at the time when Stalin was around, scientists and engineers had been too afraid to experiment and invent. And so he wanted to free things up a bit so that people were able to create new things to help development and make Russia great. So next, here's a mnemonic to help remember what happened after this speech. He goes through this program of de-Stalinisation, getting rid of everything to do with Stalin. So I would like you to pause the video and look over the mnemonic and start to summarize it in your own words in your notes. What did Khrushchev do to de-Stalinize the USSR? So pause the video now and try to do that. Basically, de-Stalinisation gave Western and Eastern European leaders hope that Khrushchev would be friendlier than Stalin, and that relations between all countries would improve. Another thing that led Western and Eastern European leaders to be more hopeful about the future was the idea of peaceful coexistence that Khrushchev often spoke about. Here are some quotes that made other world leaders hopeful. In Britain in 1956, Khrushchev said, "You, the British people, do not like communism. We, the Russians, do not like capitalism. There's only one way out, peaceful coexistence. We can only agree to disagree." And again, in 1959, Khrushchev said, "We may argue, but the main thing is to argue without using weapons." So he seemed to want peace, and he seemed to want no more war or fighting. However, in 1955, a collective security agreement called the Warsaw Pact was signed by the USSR and its satellite states in response to West Germany joining NATO. And a reminder about what NATO is: NATO was short for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in which Western countries agreed to help each other if any country was invaded or threatened. So, for example, if the USSR went to war against the USA, then all of the countries in NATO, like Canada and the UK, would come to the USA's aid. And the Warsaw Pact actually functioned exactly like NATO, but it was between the USSR and Eastern European satellite states. And the USSR was like the big controller of the agreement. The actual agreement's name was the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. So the Warsaw Pact is one example of how Khrushchev wasn't always that friendly. We'll see more examples in our next video. And the last thing to mention is that Khrushchev's ideas about de-Stalinization and peaceful coexistence actually led to an increase in tension. First, de-Stalinization led people in Eastern Europe to be hopeful that they would get more control and freedom from the USSR. And as a result, we get anti-Soviet rebellions developing throughout the region. We'll see an example of this in our next video. Second, the Warsaw Pact made the USA increase their defense spending and spending in NATO. Third, there was a lot of competition between Russia and the USA at this time. For example, the arms race, the space race, and in sporting competitions like the Olympics. All of these competitions were the USA and USSR trying to prove that their way to do things was the best way. So Russia was trying to prove that communism was the best, and the USA was trying to prove that capitalism was the best. The fourth, America got tough on communism in its own country, and it searched out communists all over the place and got rid of them. And finally, there was a lot of spying that occurred at this time, which increased tension. We'll look at an example of spying in a future video. So this is Khrushchev and the Thaw. It didn't really turn out to be a thaw in the end, but at the beginning of Khrushchev's reign, there was hope that there would be. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.